we're actually going to head now into a panel conversation on ESG. So as we do that, I'm going to invite you again to return to Slido, and I've got a poll that I'd love to ask, just to gauge the temperature of the room before we delve into this conversation on ESG. So I'm just going to ask you to head to Slido, and we're going to ask you a question around what your take is on ESG. So jump in there and we'll get a bit of a read, and we'll push that poll up in a moment. Just also to flag, while you're in Slido, this is going to be the first of the many conversations over the summit where I'd love for you to submit your questions. So please feel free at any stage to put them in, and we'll certainly turn to them over the course of our conversation. So jump on in and answer that question. While you do that, I'm going to invite to join me back on stage the phenomenal Gillian Tett, multi-award winning journalist. Joining her, we have Lindsay Patrick, the Managing Director and Head of Strategic Initiatives and ESG at RBC Capital Markets, and Steve Varley, the EY Global Vice Chair of Sustainability. Please make them all feel welcome as they join me on stage. Welcome, welcome. Pick whichever colour you might like.
I'm going green.
Yeah, I'm glad they didn't actually match me to the pink. I might have entirely blended in camouflage style today. Welcome, Steve. Welcome, Lindsay, so much. Gillian, thank you for a really phenomenal kickoff. We might see if we can push the results of our poll and put that live and just get the temperature of the room in a moment so our panellists can have a look at that. But in the meantime, I invite you both, firstly, to respond to what it was that Gillian shared. But Steve, I wanted to start with you if I can. We had a conversation in the lead up to this event, obviously preparing for today. And I love two of the phrases that you used to describe ESG. So I thought we might start there. You said it's a many-headed beast, and it's an unruly teenager that needs to grow up quickly. And I would love if you could expand on why you think those are both apt phrases for ESG.
Sure, well, maybe I'll start off by saying I think ESG overall is net positive, but it's currently having a lot of challenges. So if you go back in history a little bit, the first time that ESG became popularized as a three-letter acronym was the United Nations in 2006. So it's kind of 16 years old. From my perspective, for those of you that have or know 16-year-olds, it has all the tendencies of a 16-year-old. Some days it's absolutely fantastic and sweet as you like. On other days, though, may be prone to being a little unruly, to the level of tantrums, to the level of being downright strange.
I think everyone in the audience is going, they're more of the latter than the former if they've got teenagers in the house.
Well, maybe. I couldn't possibly comment on my lovely 16-year-old daughter at this point, but maybe there are some of the traits there. So ESG, though, is a many-headed beast. For some of us, ESG is a way for organizations to understand their corporate risk across environmental, social, and governance matters. For others, it's a way of marketing to us investment products that are labeled ESG, with a view that you invest in these and you'll do well as doing good. I'm not so sure that in the near future, the many heads of ESG can still be contained within that three-letter acronym. So I'm not here to put ESG to bed. I think it's a really good concept. And many of us are seeing real good being done because of ESG investing and the way companies are thinking about their future and ESG. But, and then there's a big but, we're at a crossroads. I think in the next 2 to 3 years, we'll see dramatic changes in the way ESG works and who owns it and puts out standards. So that's where I'm coming from, Holly, and I'd be happy to pick up now or later and expand upon those things, but ESG net overall good. We're going through some growing pains, and I think in the next few years we'll see some big changes in the way that we and the financial community and corporates think about ESG.
Absolutely, and we can see the poll results here. Overwhelmingly, people think it's well-intentioned but lacks teeth, followed by a good step in the right direction but not a big enough one, and a growing percentage around a whole lot of greenwashing, which is interesting. Lindsay, when we spoke, you talked about the idea that one of the interesting parts of this whole conversation at the moment is the way ESG is being weaponized. And I thought I'd invite you, I'd love for you to add into what Steve shared there, but just to talk about that dynamic of this conversation too.
Yeah, sure. And I also have an unruly 16-year-old and a whole host of other teenagers in my head.
There we go. You're all resonating.
2006 was a good year, apparently. Yeah. I might step back and I think how ESG has been personalized is part of the fault where it's wrong. ESG is not a noun. It's referred to as a movement. I don't see it as a movement. Environmental, social governance, these are factors. These are data points. It's a lens to look through business decision, corporate decision making. And those factors, I think it's about transparency and communicating more broadly than the systems, Gillian, that you had so correctly highlighted in your speech. So I think it's important to take that personality out of it. ESG was never meant to save the world, contrary to what The Economist may have thought, in their cover last month. But it's meant to be a different lens to look through how business is being done, how value is being created. And so I think part of the growing pains that we're going through, and the teenager analogy is a good one, is less about what ESG was intentioned to do, and more about being really honest with what are the implications. Let's get back to the root cause, what we're trying to address, what these factors really mean, and put it properly in that context. All these other solutions around climate finance, green finance, addressing some of the sustainable development goals are not ESG, and in my view, should be put in a different bucket.
Absolutely. Gillian, I'd love to get your thoughts on both those opening remarks.
Well, I would simply echo what I said, that I think the ESG framework contains many flaws, but it's not the main thing. The main thing is a zeitgeist shift about how we imagine business. And it's a reaction to the Milton Friedman idea in the middle of the 20th century that business was just there for shareholders, and the only thing investors had to care about were returns. And that has dominated Western business thinking and business schools for many, many decades. And it's got advantages: accountability, clarity of purpose, efficiency. The disadvantages, though, are if you ignore the context of business, you will end up creating big problems. And one of the things I find fascinating is that in many ways, even if you wanted to just pursue a Milton Friedman vision of the world today, the fact is that Milton Friedman was a product of his time. His context mattered, and his context was that post-World War II, the population believed that it was government's job to solve social problems, and post-World War II, people had no idea what companies were doing most of the time, and people who didn't like what companies were doing had no way to organize against it. Today, with digital transparency, radical transparency, people are monitoring companies, and increasingly polls show they expect business to get involved in dealing with problems. So I often think that if Milton Friedman was alive today, he would still be looking increasingly at things like stakeholderism to protect shareholder value, because if you ignore stakeholders, you may end up harming shareholders. And that, to my mind, is a really big message around ESG, not these irritating acronyms and this hellish alphabet soup. Many years ago, I used to cover credit derivatives and the financial sector, and I used to joke, I couldn't imagine a world which had more acronyms than the credit and derivatives market.
And you found one.
I've now found one.
Holly, I can maybe just
Go
add
for it.
Any of you that haven't read the Milton Friedman piece that Gillian just referred to, I think it was in the New York Times in about 1971. And Friedman put in that a Nobel Prize-winning economist. He said that it's very clear that the business of business is business, as in shareholder return to end investors. I think we would say now, and we at EY would definitely say, the business of business is bigger than business. And that maybe frames what ESG could become, is trying to make sure that business has an understanding of the externalities that it impacts and takes those into account at the same level of financial return to investors. And that's the stakeholder capitalism movement that Gillian referred to in her previous speech as well. It's well worth going back to that New York Times article in 1970, 1971 to read through it, just so you see how perhaps objectionable it is compared to the thinking that prevails today, the good thinking that prevails today.
It's worth looking at that article and saying, he lived in an era where there were no websites like Glassdoor. No one actually knew what was happening inside companies. There were no things like satellites tracking carbon emissions. There was no way of people telling which companies were polluting and which weren't. It was a very different era.
Speaks to your point around context, doesn't it? And why it matters so much. I want to ask something of all of you, because you've kind of touched on it in different ways. And broadly, for those who've been here since year one of Energy Disruptors, it's a shift that we've noticed in the conversation dramatically as well. And Lindsay, you mentioned the word intention earlier in your answer. Originally, there was this piece really around, it was just it was great aspiration, it's something we should be doing. There were sort of no questions asked that were more nuanced than that necessarily. And as all of you have touched on in different degrees, there's an intention piece and then there's a reality of how this is playing out and the imperfections perhaps. I'm interested to ask each of you, and both Steve and Lindsay, yourselves from your business perspective, Gillian from your market perspective, dealing with so many companies, can you talk to us about leaning into that challenge? What does that actually mean? Like, Lindsay, you've got ESG in your portfolio. How do you navigate that challenge and thinking about what that means for RBC, for example?
I don't think there's a navigation, quite frankly. It's not, in my perspective, it's not about trade-offs. It's about additives and addition, bringing this lens into how we do business, bringing this advice into the traditional financial advice we give our businesses, bringing this data set into how we evaluate loans and the risk of our lending portfolio going forward. It's all additive. So this whole notion that there is tension between financial returns or financial results and ESG results, I think, quite frankly, is overblown. I think when you're going more into the world of impact and creating positive impact and investing for solutions which may not be economically viable today, those are instances where there may be trade-offs. Some of the social investments, for example, around low-income housing and a variety of things where the hurdle rates are more difficult to meet, there will be trade-offs. But why we live in a data economy and an information economy, we value transparency, we're increasingly valuing authenticity from our leaders. Why are we not just embracing this additional information as a better information tool? That's how I view it. And as a bank, that's a key competitive advantage for us, is our fund manager clients having an information asymmetry and be able to take views on some of this information is a competitive advantage.
Can I jump in there and say one very interesting thing that happened during the pandemic was that it turned out that the companies with high ESG scores in their supply chain oversight tended to perform better than many of the others when it came to dealing with supply chain logistical problems. And the reason wasn't necessarily that ESG was some kind of magic tool that suddenly made everyone create robust supply chains. It was more that in order to actually get any type of ESG analysis done inside a company, you have to spend a lot of time getting very granular and drilling down into what's actually happening and looking at first, second, third order consequences of how you run the company. And that type of granular data and information is now possible to get because of the rise of digital transparency. But once you have that, you're probably going to be better placed to be robust for shocks. So one way to say that look at ESG metrics is that it's simply a sign of a company that's well run.
Completely. I want to double click on data for a second if we can. You mentioned it's a hellish alphabet soup. You could also argue ESG is a data lake maybe, in the sense that there's 600 metrics that are floating around broadly where people are evaluating ESG. There's really not a universal sense of that now. How important is progress on that and how's that being lent into, maybe Steve, I'll come to you first, but Gillian, I'd also appreciate your perspective.
Well, it's going to be fundamental, isn't it, that if we can't measure, we can't judge, we can't support, we can't help, we can't cajole. On occasion, we can't punch our way to help corporates do a better job. So the data is incredibly important. The taxonomy of the data, I would argue, is even more important. And then technology to allow you to collect data from around the enterprise you're working, to roll it all up so that executives can report out to investors and other stakeholders. All that's incredibly important. But then here's maybe part of the problem. Annual reports and investor reports, the data says, are less read every year that goes by. There's more data, but less information, and many would argue less understanding. So it can't just be about the data. It can't just be about that. Fundamentally, what we haven't worked out on this agenda, and if I take ESG, then the E, and then the C within E of climate change, we haven't all worked out how to motivate corporates to decarbonize at the pace the world needs. We haven't worked that out. The answer isn't going to be doing more data, doing more reports. There's the action piece. So we've got a big action gap. Maybe that's the intent gap you mentioned earlier. And I think that's a big conversation to have over these 3 days. And then as we lead towards COP27, the UN climate conference in Egypt in Sharm el-Sheikh in November, because that has to be an action-oriented event, or there's no way that we'll keep the planet on a 1.5-degree pathway.
Gillian, I mean, it speaks to a little bit of the audience response earlier, this idea, well-intentioned but lacks teeth, or even some of the comments around greenwashing. I think part of it is this perception that it's a PR exercise and it doesn't really have rigour behind it. What's your observation on how that's progressing and how substantive you think a lot of the broader business progress in this area is to making ESG really robust?
Well, I'm going to be honest and say that when I first heard the term ESG and got bombarded with email pitches from public relations people back in about 2014, 2015, 2016, I, like most journalists, went, oh, this is all basically BS. I used to joke with my colleagues that ESG should stand for eye roll, sneer, and groan, because basically that was how most journalists looked on it. And certainly there has been plenty of BS and hypocrisy in the sector in the past. It's worth stepping back for a moment and asking, again, as an anthropologist, why there is this effort to talk about ESG when it's not always matched by action, and that people are doing it because the rhetorical expectations, the zeitgeist has shifted. The baseline of what we consider normal has changed. I mean, 30 years ago, no one bothered to do this in big companies because they didn't feel they had to do it. They might have a CSR department, but that was like a little ring-fenced, part of the company. There wasn't the social pressure to even be trying to talk about this. So in some ways, the fact that people even feel they have to try and talk about it is progress, and it's a victory for the original campaigners. But I would add to that actually, although there is plenty of greenwashing, of lack of consistency in standards, plenty of problems with the framework, there's also a lot of very interesting stuff that's actually genuinely changing. Yeah. I mean, companies are actually doing stuff to get to net zero. You're hearing at this event this week about an extraordinary explosion of entrepreneurial energy around the energy transition. That is real. At Unger Week, we were just talking backstage earlier, you've got big companies like Fortescue coming out and saying, we're going to put $6.2 billion into renewables, hydrogen, to try and decarbonize. That is real. So there is real stuff going on right now. And of course, the challenge for the outside world and for journalists is to try and distinguish the real from the not so real, and also to avoid falling into that lazy intellectual trap of assuming, well, just because this bit here might be hypocritical, the whole thing's hypocritical, and it's absolutely not.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. What we are seeing amongst our client base is that the home of ESG is moving. So we convened a group of chief financial officers in New York last week, and the message was pretty clear. ESG is coming to you. It is moving from the marketing or from the corporate responsibility group. I feel for many institutions, it's found a home in the legal group right now as we go through some of those challenges, and it's going to finance. We're going to report on standardized ESG metrics every bit the way that we report on financial metrics. They're going to be comparable, they're going to be standardized, and it's going to it's going to give, I think, a lot of confidence to the end users of that demand, certainly in the financial sector, that this information is decision useful information, and it's not just however it's been calculated and however it's been presented in an ESG report. So I'm really excited and confident about that.
Right. I'd add one other thing, which is that if you look back over financial history, it's true that whenever you get an innovation of any sort, whether it's securitization, the creation of derivatives, anything like that, the first phase is always marked by tremendous label confusion. It's run like a cottage industry. There's lots of different competing frameworks being used. It's extremely opaque. There's a lot of hype. There's the potential for accidents. All of that happens in the first stage of any type of financial innovation. And so in some ways what we're seeing right now, as we get more scrutiny and a bit more rigor, and people questioning the original tenets of this revolution, in some ways that is a sign, to go back to Steve's point, of the sector growing up. It's not yet growing up perfectly. I personally think that aside from looking at the question of data, there needs to be much more clarity in distinguishing between inputs and outputs. Are you measuring the impact of the world on a company or the footprint a company has on the world? And there also needs to be much more maturity in actually acknowledging the trade-offs. Not so much in the question of whether you're making a trade-off between returns, profitability, and, if you like, your moral compass, but the trade-offs between the E and the S, and the G, because you can't always chase the E and the S equally. That's okay, but people should be much more clear and honest about those trade-offs.
Lindsay, I'm watching you nod. Did you want to jump in? You both do.
One, I'm really grateful because I think, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, everybody thought ESG was about carbon emissions specifically, and reducing carbon emissions. And Steve, you framed it out as there's ESG and then the E and then the C within the E. So it's really important to remember that GHG emissions, not just carbon emissions, but reducing emissions more broadly is only a pillar of what the ESG movement is. And I'm quite comforted by this conference that we're taking a broader lens and we understand the intersectionality of the environmental factors and the social factors, because at the end of the day, you need a social license in order to achieve this massive economic transition we're undergoing.
Steve, go for it.
I was going to do a terrible thing, right? Because we've said 3-letter acronyms bad. I'm now going to do an FLA, a 4-letter acronym.
Ooh, here we go.
Because
race for it.
I think part of the challenge and part of the direction ESG has gone down is ignoring the F for financial returns. So what I'd like to see is F for financial return, or F for financials, reunited with its three friends of E, S, and G. I think the separation of ESG into a different line of reporting could actually be creating more harm than good. Fundamentally, capitalism, which, when it is unleashed properly and guarded by good regulations, is a tremendous systemic change, force for good. It makes a lot of difference positively when you get capitalism right. But separating off F, which is one expression of capitalism, for financials from E, S, and G, I think has made both parties the poorer. Maybe it's bouncing off where I think both Gillian and Lindsay were, reuniting them. And I don't really want us to have FESG, but you kind of get the meaning. Bringing them back together, making them best friends again, talking about financial return, environmental return, social return, governance, financial impact, environmental impact. Doing that together as a group, I think would be welcomed. And actually, I find the corporates might be more willing to accept the language and the direction of the push for the nice parts of ESG.
I feel like FESG could have some communications challenges, but I'm with you on the principles sitting behind it. But to your point around, one of the critical problems we need to solve for right now is how to really ignite a fire under capital markets to move more and more in the direction of the energy transition. I'd be interested for all your views in the role ESG plays, perfectly or imperfectly, in that, kind of picking up on Steve's comment there.
So maybe I'll jump off sitting in capital markets.
You're in the capital markets.
Yeah. So, and when I think of a whole lot of greenwashing, one of the perhaps most controversial elements around ESG right now is the notion of sustainability-linked financial structures. So that's integrating ESG performance targets into a loan or a bond where the issuer, the borrower's incentive is rewarded if they meet a predetermined target. There are only two key rules right now for sustainability-linked structures. One, they have to be ambitious, so they have to go beyond business as usual. And then second, they need to be meaningful, which means material to your overall portfolio. So for example, you don't really want to see a sustainability-linked structure in a high-emitting sector where the only performance target is on diversity of the board of directors. You need something that's meaningful and core to their overall business. The problem is, in the sustainability-linked structure, outside those two guardrails, there are no standards. And so there are a variety of different structures that are coming to the market today, and it's up to the bankers, the capital markets, the end investors to judge those. We will see a lot. So one, is the structure good? There's no question. It's integrating sustainability into financial structures. And I will say from our lens, the work we do with borrowers, they go through, and I will tell you, we had a very large industrial company want to do a sustainability-linked bond. They went through their emissions reduction, their emissions reporting and the targets they were saying, and they said, you know what? It's not up to staff. We're not ready to put this in a financial structure yet. They took 6 months, went back to the books, recalculated all their emissions, upgraded their processes, and set targets based on a new higher standard that the financial structure enabled them to do so. So that's, it's incremental, it's additive. Is it going to get to net zero by 2050? I don't know. But is it a way to integrate the financial markets and the capital markets into the great initiatives that we see companies doing? Absolutely.
Gillian, I welcome your comments on that, but I do want to come to our audience questions too, and the one that's been upvoted to the top has your name on it, which is specifically, what are we being silent about in energy?
In energy, I haven't thought about it so much in relation to energy. I'd say that probably one thing that people haven't been thinking about enough yet is the trade-off between the E and the S. And also some of the geopolitical consequences of what happens if we, frankly, move away from a dependency on fossil fuels and fossil fuel politics. I don't think people have quite got their heads around that yet. There's elements of the whole supply chain which people have been ignoring for a surprisingly long time. All the rare earth minerals, all the things like lithium, were just ignored almost completely for a very long time. So those are the things I'd say off the top of my head in relation to energy. I thought less about energy. In relation to the bigger world, I mean, the type of silences I see today are, one around the basic issue of debt, which just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and everyone assumes will just kind of always be there and keep growing, and we ignore it. The fact that since the financial crisis, the ratio of global debt to GDP has gone up by about 80 percentage points is astonishing. No one ever talks about it. Pension systems, again, another area where I think people just are not talking about that properly. I can go on and on. Antibiotic resistance, an issue that I'm increasingly obsessed with, but it gets very little discussion in public.
Interesting. Sorry, to go for
I could maybe provide another one where I don't know if it's silent, but I'd like to see more dialogue and more noise. I'm going to try and connect two things together here. So we all know that with the present prices of hydrocarbons, some companies are making extraordinary amounts of money. As the CEO of a major British super major oil company said, it's like a cash machine. Now let me try and connect that with back into the world of COPs and the famous COP Paris Agreement, which had 5 major outcomes, one of which was an agreement where $100 billion of financing per annum would be provided for 2 countries to help them mitigate the impact of climate change and basically skip the Industrial Revolution. Now, as we rolled into Glasgow for COP26, there's a strong view from what the UN called the LDCs, the less developed countries, that nowhere near enough money had been put forward compared to the $100 billion that was promised, which the less developed countries said the reason they signed the Paris Agreement that made it so iconic and successful was because of that clause and because of that commitment. I'd love to see a bigger dialogue on how we can make that $100 billion more available to the countries that really need it. And if you want to know a country that needs it today, look at what's happened to Pakistan, where a third of the country was submerged, and now over a third of the country's roads are not usable. Pakistan really needs adaptation funding. And at one level, we've got extraordinary profits. Now, I'm not talking about windfall taxes or whatever, but a big conversation on how we can unite both of those, I think would move the world forward massively.
Yeah, I would very strongly agree with that because, one of the things that's not being discussed in the headlines in UNGA this week at the Climate Week and United Nations General Assembly is a dreadful pain being felt by emerging market countries, many emerging market countries, and the extreme levels of anger that they feel, and increasing levels of anger towards the developed world.
We get a question here on that too. How do we get to net zero given that heightened geopolitical tension? There's a reality around how this is playing out very differently across emerging markets and developed, and some of the world's most populous nations feel very differently about this situation to some of us sitting here.
Absolutely. I mean, there is a chance that the COP27 talks in Egypt in November could be something of a car crash because of this level of anger that's being felt. And what countries like India are doing right now, on the one hand, it's encouraging because there is a real recognition of the need to talk seriously about decarbonization. There is innovation happening in India. There's been a real shift in the conversation. But there's also a sense of anger towards the West about this.
Absolutely. Now, Lindsay, we haven't really touched on politics yet, but I know you're really passionate about the role policy has in the ESG landscape too. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, there's an interesting question on, how are politicians using ESG? And frankly, I don't even hear the term used by politicians. You know, they have different environmental and social agendas. It's a corporate term and a financial term. And I think, unfortunately, it now has evolved, particularly south of this border into the state, as a political hot wire, primarily on that, you know, with that financial lens. But that's not the lens that I see. Politicians are always going to have certain pet issues or certain issues that are important to them based on the regions and the people that they're representing and based on the overall commitments and commitments their governments have made. I don't see it as politicized, quite frankly, at those levels as I do within the media, as in I do within other sectors of the economy, frankly.
Do you feel similarly?
I think there's a fascinating debate to watch what's happening in some of the US states, and maybe take Texas, where the Texas comptroller, the attorney general, have written to several large investment organizations like BlackRock to remind them, and I put that in italics, to remind them of their fiduciary duty to deliver just, again in italics, shareholder returns, which goes back to the Milton Friedman point that was done in 1970. So I think there's going to be an interesting debate, which will probably become political, if not in the November midterms this year, then definitely I would have thought in the next US election, on the roles that states have in incentivizing, encouraging, or not, ESG investments. So Texas probably tracked that in Gillian's moral money piece in the Financial Times. But that, I think, is being watched by many European countries to make sure that they don't have there's no appetite within that country for ESG to become another populist lightning rod.
Gillian, what's your view there on the role of states and the evolution?
Yeah, I mean, what's happening right now in America is fascinating because there is a very energetic backlash in parts of the Republican Party. One sign of that is what's happening in fact, 13 states have come together, the treasurers, and they are taking measures, if not to crimp the wings of ESG, but to basically try and threaten companies that are following an ESG mandate by taking away their investment from public pension funds and state pension funds. That's very striking. It puts companies into an impossible position if you're operating in America today as a big financial entity, because for the most part, you can't operate in places like New York and California and liberal states without having some ESG mandate. You can't win business, but then you can't win business in places like Texas if you do have an ESG mandate. So trying to square that circle for companies like BlackRock is incredibly hard. The other big thing that's happened, which is potentially even more significant, is the Supreme Court overruled the Environmental Protection Agency's ruling on trying to curb one aspect of carbon emissions during the summer. It got drowned out by Roe v. Wade. In some ways, though, it's more consequential because leaving aside the specific details of that case, the implications are that agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency or the Securities and Exchange Commission no longer have the ability to enforce rules that haven't been very explicitly backed by Congress. And as we all know, right now the American Congress is almost completely incapable of doing anything swiftly at all. So a very literal reading of that ruling, which is what many Republicans are doing right now, would suggest that neither the EPA nor the SEC can do anything meaningful in the sphere of ESG without a legal challenge. That is incredibly important for anybody whose job is to try and invest, build businesses, sell products in America today, because it takes away one of the bedrocks of American capitalism, which is legal certainty. And that's potentially very troubling. So all of that's happening in the sphere of politics. You have people like Mike Pence coming up and talking about woke capitalism and trying to tackle this. And yet, the point I can't stress strongly enough is that on the private sector level, there's just a plethora of energy and activity happening almost in spite of that. So it's a very sort of contradictory, confusing picture right now in America.
Can I ask you about one thing that might have been described by Mike Pence under the banner of woke capitalism before we move on? I want to pick up an audience question in a moment. But you've written a lot at the Financial Times about activist shareholders, about green whistleblowing and the like. What role does that play in all this ESG conversation? Because it's often one of the ways that you're reading about it at the moment. You know, companies being taken to court, you know, these organisations taking seats on the board with the view to try and steer companies in a different direction. I'd be interested for your view on that as part of this debate and conversation.
Well, there's two things going on. One is that the green whistleblowing is increasing, and it's spreading beyond the traditional companies, oil and gas companies, to the professional services, the advertising world, the PR world. They're also starting to see whistleblowing activity, and that's very interesting. In terms of the question of shareholder activism, you know, there's been this long debate, which I'm sure you have strong views about whether if you want to, you know, pursue an ESG agenda, should you divest or invest? And certainly in the first phase, there probably was a lot of focus on divesting. Very unclear that you can show it's actually affecting the cost of capital when it's involving the public equity markets. You know, if banks cut off loans, that has an impact. If people divest from a company, it's not clear it really changes behavior that much. So people are increasingly focusing on investing and engaging and trying to change, and essentially copying what the nuns, bless them, have been doing, the activist nuns in America for years, which is trying to invest and then go and actually make a noise at AGMs. Until recently, until Engine Room number 1, there wasn't much sign that that had actually delivered big scalps. But when Engine Room number 1, a tiny hedge fund that owned a minuscule amount of Exxon's shares, persuaded the other big investors like BlackRock and Vanguard to follow them, they actually had a real impact on Exxon and forced significant board change. And in the aftermath of that, I think we're going to see a lot more engagement going forward.
And Lindsay, what Derek talked about earlier this morning, right, that whole greater green piece is one component of this, but would love your thoughts on this.
You know, where it works is the intersection that comes back to, I think, where we started this conversation of financial returns and ESG data and transparency. And so there has to be financial materiality to the ESG issues that that the shareholder is bringing to board, and over for big institutional investors support it. Strategic rationale, financial rationale. If it's sort of a policy or, you know, again, an NGO pet project that may not have true financial implications, it's not going to get the same traction. So that's, you know, I think front and center is it has to be embedded in the financials. The second piece around policy, and I think, you know, stepping back, the biggest role for government is to set a very clear long-term framework and stable environment for investment. Capital will follow opportunity. And capital will follow opportunity if it can also prove to have great financial returns with meaningful environmental and social objectives at the same time that we can measure. And with policy going back and forth and changing the price of carbon, we have one, we don't have one, changing the rules of investment, that's where capital stays away. So if we really, that's from my view, we can talk about policies, carrot incentives, penalties, carrots and sticks. Just providing this is where the road's going to go for the next 20 years, you know, is the first condition, I think, to bring capital to the table.
So picking up on what you're talking about there, I might come perfectly to that audience question. How do you incentivize people to take the risk required to make those bold moves? You mentioned that sensitivity, right? It needs to be clear. Investors want confidence and stability. What's the right way to think about incentives in that frame? Steve, maybe you first?
Sure. Let me actually just come back to Engine number 1, which is a fantastic case study. In fact, I'd encourage you all to go onto the internet and download, I think it's a public document. I'm almost sure it's a public document. Engine number 1's letter they wrote to the board of ExxonMobil, which is one of the most articulate corporate strategy nudges I've read over my 25 years plus in professional services. It's a really good read. And this organization, which I think had less than $40 million invested in this huge ExxonMobil company, managed to get boardroom seats. The letter is a really good read, unpacking Exxon's strategy and suggesting another course of action. But let me come back to your question, Holly. So I think the next 3 years or so are going to see some significant changes in corporate reaction to ESG, and let me use the word sustainability. So over the last few years at WEF and other places, we've seen CEOs on stage making pledges and promises of what their organization will do to decarbonize, to protect biodiversity, to have better human rights in their supply chains. Those pledges and promises have now been tracked by lots of activist investors. Some activist investors want a financial return. Some of them just want change on ESG agenda items. I suspect what we'll find over the next few years is those pledges and promises will look, once you look at the progress and performance, like there's been nowhere near enough delivered. I think a lot of CEOs are going to find themselves under more and more pressure because activists and maybe normal shareholders and broader stakeholders will hold them to account in a speech they made maybe in 2018 or 2019, maybe in a snowy alpine village called Davos, maybe they got applause from their peer groups, maybe their picture appeared in the media. Those chickens, Holly, are going to come home to roost. Now the pandemic's cleared away, and there's less opportunity to be opaque. Now it'll come down to progress and performance. Have these companies managed to decarbonize at the pace they said they would at, crucially, the same time as delivering their earnings promised to the street? That's a really big test.
Absolutely.
And I think that will play out in boardrooms and then the media over the next few years.
And if I can add, one stakeholder that we advise our clients often that is forgotten is the employee stakeholder. And when you look at large corporations that employ tens and thousands of employees, it's the employees now that are really raising their voice and holding their companies accountable for the pledges that are being made and want to see tangible progress.
And
that was your point, a growing phenomenon too.
Yeah, it's particularly true. It's very interesting. If you look at the tech sector, for example, for the most part, investors haven't had that much influence or impact because it doesn't really matter if a bunch of investors sell. I mean, there's so much capital running into the tech sector that actually that isn't the lever to change company behavior. But if you look at companies like Google in relation to gender issues, if you look at Amazon in relation to the environment questions, if you look at even companies like Apple, time and again you're seeing the employees actually organizing and trying to force and pressurize a company to change. And certainly a company like Amazon appears to have really changed course quite significantly in response to employee pressure over carbon emissions rather than external pressure from either protesters or Democrat politicians or shareholders.
Now, I do want to honour our most upvoted question. And there's a question saying, I'm noticing a trend of people in the past were wrong, we have the right way of thinking now recently. Do we need a shift in this mindset? Any thoughts on that? The idea that there's nothing in the past to learn from, perhaps?
Well, part of the anthropology philosophy of life is that we're all basically captured by the cognitive framework we inherited from our surroundings. And it's human nature to assume that it's rigid, fixed, stable, and that everyone else should have the same framework. And we always have a tendency to assume that how people thought 50 years ago or how other societies think is simply wrong. It's not true. Culture doesn't exist like a Tupperware box where it's sealed and fixed and you can stack different boxes on top of each other with a hierarchy of value. It's more like a slow-moving river where you get new streams coming in and constantly changing, and it's all a bit muddy around the edges. And the reality is that we can learn a lot from the discussions in the past, both about what to do and what not to do. And also, Western capitalism can learn a lot about other countries. I mean, the way the Japanese imagine capitalism is different from the West. But there's ideas about, corporate responsibility that, frankly, we could all learn from, and vice versa.
It's an interesting one, though, in a corporate context, right? Because there's a lot of conversation around we need to innovate, can't be stuck to the status quo, etc., which can fail to acknowledge some of the things we've got to carry through from the past, or go back in history to not necessarily find answers, perhaps find better questions even.
I'll say one thing on that. Also, Adam Smith is seen as the father of modern capitalism. Everyone looks at one book, which was The Wealth of Nations, about the power of competition to drive innovation and growth. His second book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, has often been ignored. But it was basically saying you can't have competition in markets without a shared moral, social, legal framework. And in some ways, all that's happening today is we're going back to the future and trying to reconnect these two books in this whole sustainability movement.
We've had an incredibly wide-ranging conversation that has rapidly drawn to a close, but I wanted to finish by asking each of you, we've covered a lot of territory. This is a very complex and nuanced conversation. It's evolving rapidly. I'd love to ask for your closing thoughts on what meaning you'd invite our audience to make of this. We're talking to a room full of leaders who are interfacing with this challenge, as a lot of the questions spoke to. They're leaning into this, they're grappling with it day to day. What would you invite them to go away and think about, provoke, start doing in their organisations in order to progress where ESG sits, or just broadly, to kind of what you were talking about, Steve, enliven kind of the incentives, the financial structures that we need to move things in a new direction?
Well, maybe I'll start off by saying I'm an optimist by character, but I'm an optimist that worries a lot. And part of my worry on this ESG agenda and then sustainability, climate change, biodiversity, is that for many of us, we don't really understand that while sustainability is everybody's business, it doesn't start with them, it starts with us, and it starts with me. And what changes am I going to make? So my encouragement is to think through what you do with the dollars you spend. Where is your pension money of today? Where's that really going? Do you really know where your financial power is going? And do you really know and think through your voting power? So it'd be quite easy for me to sit on stage and talk about corporates and all the things that corporates are doing. But I think it's quite maybe apt to end with a point that is, this is down to each of us to make a difference, not to look to them to make a difference. Let's start this with us, and then maybe we can all have a more optimistic future.
I love that. Do you know where your economic and your political power are going? Lindsay, what would you add in?
Such a great point. I would say this is a terrific audience, 2,000 people. Everybody here clearly forward-thinking. Embrace your own power to educate. There is so much confusion about what ESG is, what climate finance, sustainability. You understand, use your power and advocate when you see misrepresentations amongst your family, friends, in the media. You have the power to educate and be the voice of truth and reason, so use it.
I love it. Embrace your role as an educator. Gillian?
I would go back to the point I made just now, which is try and reconnect the two books of Adam Smith, and in some ways to go back to the future, and to recognize that the vision of capitalism that's dominated for the last 50 years, since Milton Friedman's famous 1970 essay, was a product of a particular moment in history, and it doesn't mean that it's universal.
Absolutely. Great closing thoughts. Can you thank me for a phenomenal panel session? Steve, Lindsay, and Gillian. Brilliant. Thank you all.
Thank you, Holly.